that he now looked up at Allan. It was with an effort that he roused himself to answer. "It shall be as you wish," he said, quietly. "I'm sorry for what has happened, but I'm not the less obliged to you, Allan, for having done what I asked you." His head sank on his breast, and the fatalist resignation which had once already quieted him on board the wreck now quieted him again. "What must be, will be," he thought once more. "What have I to do with the future, and what has he?" "Cheer up," said Allan. "Your affairs are in a thriving condition, at any rate. I paid one pleasant visit in the town, which I haven't told you of yet. I have seen Pedgift, and Pedgift's son, who helps him in the office. They are the two jolliest lawyers I ever met with in my life; and what's more, they can produce the very man you want to teach you the steward's business." Midwinter looked up quickly. Distrust of Allan's discovery was plainly written in his face already, but he said nothing. "I thought of you," Allan proceeded, "as soon as the two Pedgifts and I had had a glass of wine all round to drink to our friendly connection. The finest sherry I ever tasted in my life. I've ordered some of the same. But that's not the question just now. In 2 words, I told these worthy fellows your difficulty, and in 2 seconds old Pedgift understood all about it. 'I've got the man in my office,' he said, 'and before the audit day comes, I'll place him with the greatest pleasure at your friend's disposal.'" At this last announcement, Midwinter's distrust found its expression in words. He questioned Allan unsparingly. The man's name, it appeared, was Bashwood. He had been some time, how long Allan could not remember, in Mr. Pedgift's service. He had been previously steward to a Norfolk gentleman, name forgotten, in the westward district of the county. He had lost the steward's place through some domestic trouble in connection with his son, the precise nature of which Allan was not able to specify. Pedgift vouched for him, and Pedgift would send him to Thorpe Ambrose 2 or 3 days before the rent day dinner. He could not be spared, for office reasons, before that time. There was no need to fidget about it. Pedgift laughed at the idea of there being any difficulty with the tenants. 2 or 3 days' work over the steward's books, with a man to help Midwinter who practically understood that sort of thing, would put him all right for the audit, and the other business would keep till afterward. "Have you seen this Mr. Bashwood yourself, Allan?" asked Midwinter, still obstinately on his guard. "No," replied Allan. "He was out with the bag, as young Pedgift called it. They tell me he's a decent elderly man, a little broken by his troubles, and a little apt to be nervous and confused in his manners with strangers, but thoroughly competent and thoroughly to be depended on. Those are Pedgift's own words." Midwinter paused and considered a little, with a new interest in the subject. The strange man whom he had just heard described, and the strange man of whom he had asked his way where the three roads met, were remarkably like each other. Was this another link in the fast lengthening chain of events? Midwinter grew doubly determined to be careful, as the bare doubt that it might be so passed through his mind. "When Mr. Bashwood comes," he said, "will you let me see him and speak to him before anything definite is done?" "Of course I will," rejoined Allan. He stopped and looked at his watch. "And I'll tell you what I'll do for you, old boy, in the meantime," he added. "I'll introduce you to the prettiest girl in Norfolk. There's just time to run over to the cottage before dinner. Come along and be introduced to Miss Milroy." "You can't introduce me to Miss Milroy to day," replied Midwinter; and he repeated the message of apology which had been brought from the major that afternoon. Allan was surprised and disappointed, but he was not to be foiled in his resolution to advance himself in the good graces of the inhabitants of the cottage. After a little consideration, he hit on a means of turning the present adverse circumstances to good account. "I'll show a proper anxiety for Mrs. Milroy's recovery," he said, gravely. "I'll send her a basket of strawberries, with my best respects, tomorrow morning." Nothing more happened to mark the end of that first day in the new house. The one noticeable event of the next day was another disclosure of Mrs. Milroy's infirmity of temper. Half an hour after Allan's basket of strawberries had been delivered at the cottage, it was returned to him intact, by the hands of the invalid lady's nurse, with a short and sharp message, shortly and sharply delivered. Mrs. Milroy's compliments and thanks. Strawberries invariably disagreed with her. If this curiously petulant acknowledgment of an act of politeness was intended to irritate Allan, it failed entirely in accomplishing its object. Instead of being offended with the mother, he sympathized with the daughter. "Poor little thing," was all he said. "She must have a hard life of it, with such a mother as that." He called at the cottage himself later in the day, but Miss Milroy was not to be seen. She was engaged upstairs. The major received his visitor in his working apron, far more deeply immersed in his wonderful clock, and far less readily accessible to outer influences, than Allan had seen him at their first interview. His manner was as kind as before, but not a word more could be extracted from him on the subject of his wife than that Mrs. Milroy had not improved since yesterday. The two next days passed quietly and uneventfully. Allan persisted in making his inquiries at the cottage, but all he saw of the major's daughter was a glimpse of her on one occasion at a window on the bedroom floor. Nothing more was heard from Mr. Pedgift, and Mr. Bashwood's appearance was still delayed. Midwinter declined to move in the matter until time enough had passed to allow of his first hearing from Mr. Brooke, in answer to the letter which he had addressed to the rector on the night of his arrival at Thorpe Ambrose. He was unusually silent and quiet, and passed most of his hours in the library among the books. The time wore on wearily. The resident gentry acknowledged Allan's visit by formally leaving their cards. Nobody came near the house afterward. The weather was monotonously fine. Allan grew a little restless and dissatisfied. He began to resent Mrs. Milroy's illness. He began to think regretfully of his deserted yacht. The next day, the 20th, brought some news with it from the outer world. A message was delivered from Mr. Pedgift, announcing that his clerk, Mr.